Welcome, everyone. My name's Uwe Brandis. I'm the Executive Director of the Urban Planning Program here at Georgetown University, and welcome to our inaugural speaker series. As you may or may not know, this is the very first semester that this degree is being offered at Georgetown, and we're delighted to have organized this inaugural speaker series. We've heard from a lot of different voices from both Washington, D.C. and across the region, from Maryland and Virginia. And we wanted to deliberately structure this as a diversity of voices. And many of the speakers that we've had this fall are public officials, in fact, almost exclusively. And having been very active in the planning landscape here in Washington myself, I can attest that the dialogue has changed, markedly so, with the advent of social media and with the amazing information sources that are available online. And even the whole process of participatory public planning has in and of itself changed with all these incredible new tools and mechanisms that we have available to us. And there is one person who I think does share some special responsibility for this, and that is David Alpert. And we're really delighted to have you here today, David. David is an entrepreneur. He certainly is a passionate stakeholder in the city's conversation, an advocate, and we look forward to your comments today to share with us really about how the conversation, the online conversation, is changing planning and what that means for Washington. So
Great.
Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm David Alpert. I founded and run Greater Washington. You can see right here what it looks like as of just this minute. It is a news website about planning, transportation, and other issues that affect the shape of the communities in the DC region. I want to talk a little bit about what we have been able to achieve with Greater Washington. And also, I actually wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what perhaps we have not been able to achieve and where I think civic dialogue needs to go from here. Where can we expand the conversation? And how can we involve more people in a discussion about the future of our region and our city? And to talk about those things, I'm also going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the issues that I think the District of Columbia in particular faces, because we need to understand what problems we are facing and what we need to solve in order to start talking about how we can loop in and involve the people that need to be a part of a dialogue about how to fix that problem. So starting with Greater Washington itself. What is Greater Washington? What has it done? And I'll also talk a little bit about other online media forums and so forth that have had an influence on planning in the DC region. I founded Greater Washington, I guess it's almost 6 years ago now, in February of 2008, to be a place where we could talk about the fundamental questions that, as planners, for those of you who are planners think about. Where should we go? What can be different from what is the case today? And the name Greater Washington is very much a part of that. There were a lot of sites that would talk about how terrible a lot of things are in Washington, D.C. Sites, with names like I Hate D.C. and that sort of thing, with people complaining about things. And of course, there's things to complain about. And then there were other sites that would just talk about how things that are great, and there are a lot of things that are great too. But what we wanted to talk about was, what I wanted us to be talking about, is how can things be different? And that's why we have the tagline, which you can see on the top left there. The Washington, D.C. area is great, but it can be greater. We would discuss what's good and what could be different. We are primarily volunteer-run site. A lot of people from all around the region, some who are just residents of different neighborhoods who care about those particular neighborhoods. Some are professional planners, maybe in one jurisdiction. Maybe they can't write about the jurisdiction that they work for, but they can talk about another part of the region. Other people are just professionals in different unrelated fields that have a lot of interest and have been reading a lot about planning, transportation, and overall the shape of our communities. People These volunteers submit articles. They write about things in local communities and region-wide. We talk a lot, as you can see on the right here, with a list of some of these are the articles that we've had recently. We talk a lot about growth issues. There are some broad articles, like the one that was most recently posted here about Mayor Gray's decision to seek re-election and what that means and how he's done. But also we have ones, as you can see in the top right, that are much more local, about the Walmarts that just opened downtown and Georgia Avenue and so forth. We talk a lot about transit. We now have a sub-blog, Greater Education, about education. Things about public spaces, like how do our sports spaces working well for people of all genders and so forth. We talk a lot about street safety in local and regional areas. Does a particular street design well serve users, or doesn't it? Historic preservation, and a lot of issues about government in general. But what ties all of this together is that what we have is sort of an analytical bent to it. We look at an issue and say, well, what is really going on here? What are the factors that are at work? And when we look at something like a proposed development or a new potential transit line or something like that, often what we're thinking about is what trade-offs are being made here. Someone who knows a little bit about the decisions that planners might make or that officials might make will look at that issue and say, well, what decisions have they made? What decisions are the right ones? What decisions maybe do we not agree with? And people are able to have an opinion as well. What that does, and the reason that has been, I think, effective at changing the conversation around planning, is it gives us an opportunity to educate people, not just about what's actually happening, but why that's happening, why something else is not happening, or what could be happening instead. Because people, when they're engaging with their communities, they see what actually happens. They see where the bus goes, they see where there's a building, and they see if there's a park here, if there's a new playground, and so on. But often, when planners bring an issue to residents, people don't really know that well what the trade-offs are behind that particular issue. Development is a really good example of this. You can build a new building, and people might say, I'd like the building to be shorter, taller, different color. I'd like it to have retail on the ground floor. I'd like it not to. I'd like there to be a park. I'd like there to be this or that. And those are all really valuable things for people to weigh in on. But people also need to understand, in order to really have a positive impact in their neighborhood, not only what's happening with that particular building, but what trade-offs we end up making when we make a particular decision. In DC in particular, there's always a strong chorus of people asking for development to be less visible, just less of it, more open space, and so on. These discussions happen all over the city and all over the region. There's always a lot of folks that will say that any building in any neighborhood that might be a little bit taller than another building it's near is too tall, is going to loom over others, is going to destroy the neighborhood as we know it. And it's certainly fair to say that such a building will have some impact. But we also have to understand what impact that building could have beyond simply what I look at. For example, if you bring more residents into a community, that's more patrons for the businesses in that community. So if you want to have more restaurants, if you bring more people in, that's more people that can go to that restaurant. New development has an impact on our tax base as well, which is very significant. It has an impact, for better or worse, on our transportation system, and so on. So when we have had this opportunity to talk with so many people around the region and educate them about these planning questions and about not only what is actually happening, but the long-term and short-term impact of what that means, the effect is that people, I think, if we're doing our job right, which sometimes we do and perhaps not always, are able to better weigh in not only on that particular thing, but on the broader question. So people are able to go to a community meeting and say, this is what I think about this building, make it look different here and there, but also I want to see I want more neighbors in my community. Also, I'd like a capital bike share station to be an amenity that this building potentially pays for, or whatever it might be. And the same thing applies to different issues. By talking about these things regionally, in addition, we have been able to let people learn not only about what's happening in their community, but other communities elsewhere. So when we talk about something like, let's say, the Walmarts, well, maybe we're just talking about the design in Georgia Avenue, and maybe we're just talking about the design downtown, but that might really affect another thing that might get built in Silver Spring, in Arlington, in Anacostia, in Friendship Heights, and so many other places. Greater Washington, by the way, to give you a little bit of background, has, over those 5 years, grown to be a fairly popular forum for these discussions. We attract about 120,000 unique visitors in a particular month. And these volunteer contributors write about 3 or 4 articles each day. And in addition, we have this feature called Breakfast Links that you can see right here, which gives short summaries of some of the main news as it relates to some of these issues about planning, transportation, and the shape of our communities. So that is a little bit about what we've been able to do. Oh, and quickly, that has been able to certainly have an impact on a number of our decisions. A lot of public processes, we have been able to help engage people, and then they go and participate in actual in-person hearings on issues like the zoning update, which is currently being debated before the DC Zoning Commission, or DC's decisions about building things like streetcars, expanding the circulator, and much more, as well as local plans. We sometimes actually exhort people to take action, but I think much more often it's about really creating this educated base of people who really understand the issues much more deeply, who then decide on their own that they understand enough about these planning issues that they want to go take action on their own volition. Because rather than just thinking vaguely, yeah, you know, that building looks kind of nice, I kind of like, you know, streetcars seem kind of nice, I like buses, instead of just that vagueness, people can actually say, I can tell you why I support this and why I don't support this other alternative. I can tell you why I think we should make this choice and not that choice. So I've talked a little bit about what we have done. What have we not done? I think that the biggest issue that I see as the kind of next frontier in this civic dialogue is finding ways to broaden this conversation beyond the base of engaged readers of Greater Washington to be, in the district, a citywide conversation where we loop in many more people. What I mean by that is, like many websites, our readership is largely, since we write fairly long articles, highly educated folks. Because we are online, it's largely people who work in office jobs who have the flexibility that they can go onto a website that maybe isn't their job during little breaks in between doing different things. So people who are actually working in front of a computer all day, which in this area is a lot of people, you know, a lot of federal employees, for example, and a lot of people in the private sector. But of course, it's not everyone in our region, and it's not everyone in every community. What are the other groups that we're not reaching? Well, to talk about that, I want to take a brief excursion to talk a little bit about the way I see the city changing, and then we can come back to therefore how that relates to civic dialogue. For many decades, DC, like many center cities, was a place that the population was declining or staying somewhat steady, and we were in an era, this was in the mid-20th century, of, as you most of you know, a period of sort of decline in center cities, and generally a lack of investment in center cities. The growth was mostly in suburbs. People saw that living in these sort of new cul-de-sac, often cul-de-sac type subdivisions, was really, you know, the thing of the future. That has shifted. But the people who were living in the district at that time, where most neighborhoods were almost always existent and built out, were largely 3 groups. You had young people right out of college who were just getting started in some of these professional jobs in the DC area and wanted to live in somewhere with great bars and restaurants and that sort of thing, were willing to live in smaller spaces and tolerate perhaps a neighborhood with somewhat higher crime than in a lot of places in the nation. This was in the era, in particular, of DC's very high crime, you know, high murder capital type of period. You had people who then often had once been that group who had decided that they wanted to stay in the city, but most of the time moved to the more established neighborhoods, often to single-family homes in the more outlying communities, often mostly west of Rock Creek Park or in the Maryland border in the far northeast. These were people that were black and white of many ages, but largely affluent and who could afford single-family homes and wanted to live in neighborhoods that were more stable and not changing perhaps as much because they wanted to seek out some of the advantages of those neighborhoods. Then you had the working class and lower income residents of the city who were, of course, some of whom were new and some of whom had lived for generations in these communities, wanted to continue to live in those neighborhoods, maybe weren't able to afford to live somewhere else, or who had strong ties to those communities. By and large, these neighborhoods felt that there was not a lot of public investment in their needs. There was some, but not enough. And that was a legitimate critique in many ways. So what's changed now is that now, as the city has gotten to be such a much more desirable place to live, many more people want to live here. In particular, it's many of the people in that first group that I listed, highly educated, of many ethnicities and so forth, often making different amounts of money, people who are at nonprofits not making a lot of money, or people who are two-lawyer families who are making a lot of money, but who really value these urban living qualities, who want to live somewhere where they can walk to a grocery store, want to be able to take the metro and not have to drive, want to be able to have parks nearby, maybe want to go by bus or by bike to jobs downtown or live near jobs. And that has created, as well as other groups being attracted to the city, a substantial population boom that has raised our population. But it's also raised the housing costs in the district. So what we essentially have is a dynamic around planning where we have a lot more people. We sort of have these kind of four groups wanting to be in the place that was formerly occupied by three groups. And what that means is that this is causing a sort of a little bit of a crowding effect, both physically and also sort of for kind of the public participation space. In other words, there are people that are participating in the civic dialogue of the city who weren't participating in the civic dialogue of the city before because maybe they weren't here. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that other groups are finding that there's some new voices that might not share all of the same views as the existing groups, and that's creating some amount of conflict. And of course, there's the physical component. There are people who want to live in neighborhoods, and there are already people in those neighborhoods. So what do we do about that problem? And I think that that's really the fundamental problem facing our city, both as a planning problem and as a civic dialogue problem. So looking at that a little bit more, what's happening? What's happening is that we are seeing an impact, as I said, sort of on the different groups. We are seeing a lot of new housing being built in places like 14th Street Northwest and H Street and so on. And that is absorbing a lot of the demand for this new housing. But it is not absorbing enough. Even though we're building considerable new housing, and we are gaining new residents at the rate of about 1,000, 1,100 a month last time the statistics were updated, that is actually not enough to meet all of the demand for people that want to come into the city. In the kind of the established neighborhoods of the second group I listed, the sort of affluent, mostly single family kind of established communities, there actually has been some impact, but what we have is a dynamic where a lot of those communities have been able to create legal obstacles to much change. There is fairly restrictive zoning that really limits how much you can build. There are limits on the number of housing units in a particular building so that someone can't rent out a garage or a basement to another person who might be younger or lower income. Essentially, those other two groups, there are laws kind of that make it harder for people in those other two groups to come into those neighborhoods in more than very small numbers. We have historic preservation regulations, which create another brake on any kind of development and another way for people to say, make that building shorter, make that building shorter, and so on. And mostly that historic preservation process has manifested itself as a system that constantly tries to take about one floor off of just about every proposal that comes before it in order to sort of kind of ostensibly for aesthetic reasons, but really it has this effect of taking these parts of the city, mostly west of Rock Creek Park, Capitol Hill to some extent, though there's more openness to change in Capitol Hill. But a lot of these neighborhoods, DuPont Circle and U Street, also sort of same thing, but to kind of push more of the change to other neighborhoods. And that's sort of the neighborhoods that are occupied by the people in that last group that I listed. And so you then have gentrification, which is, of course, that a lot of people want to move into some of these neighborhoods, but the amount of housing isn't going up. So naturally what happens by the laws of economics are that people with lower incomes find that it's harder to continue to live in some of these communities. Okay, So I've laid out sort of what the problem is. Then what do we do about that problem, and how does that come back to civic dialogue, which is what we're here to be talking about? Well, what we have to do is a few things. One is we do need to make sure that we're building enough housing to meet the demand. We have to actually accommodate all the people that want to come in. But I don't think it's simply enough to say, well, we just need to build a lot more housing, because there are impacts on lots of neighborhoods, and we have to then talk about where is that going to be. Maybe some of that, maybe it should be spread out throughout the city. Maybe some of it needs to be in some of these communities, like a Tenley town, that there has been a little bit more opposition to having some more residents, because maybe every neighborhood has to do its part. Georgetown, the neighborhood of Georgetown, as opposed to the university, also has been a place that's particularly difficult to add new residents, and I think that needs to do its part. But we don't have a political dynamic yet that really kind of is making that happen. Or we could build taller buildings downtown or in other parts of the city. And we right now have this debate over the height limit, which I won't go into a lot of detail because we could talk about for hours and hours. But a question of, well, maybe we could resolve that by building a few really tall buildings in some places and then not in other places. Or maybe we should have some more housing sort of throughout the city. Or some people say, well, just put it all east of the river or something like that. But of course, what does that mean for people that are living in the neighborhoods that would be affected? So you have to really engage everybody in this conversation. But right now, the challenge that I see is that our civic dialogue has not been about how do we build the housing that we need and where should it go. It has really been about how does each neighborhood kind of try to get it not to be in their neighborhood. The other element that's really key here is, if we talk about these sort of more lower income neighborhoods and neighborhoods that have been not felt that the investment has really come to them, the real question I think that we also need to ask is, and we have to have more conversations about, is how do we make it so that doing things like adding housing and adding residents actually does not have a negative impact on people in some of these other communities? To simply say, well, we should add some more housing, that's not really a good answer, I think, to someone who lives in a neighborhood where people are feeling priced out. Because no matter what we do, we're probably not going to build enough tomorrow. So if we just add a little bit more, and we say to someone in a neighborhood, Anacostia or Deanwood, let's say, we should have some more housing in your neighborhood because we have this need for more housing. Someone would very understandably say, and people have said to me, well, okay, but how does that make the lot of people in this neighborhood better? If you just build a building that brings in a bunch of new residents, why won't that simply just make the neighborhood more desirable to new residents and even hasten the process of change? So we have a dynamic where people in a lot of these neighborhoods are understandably very nervous about allowing some change because they are concerned about the direction that that change will ultimately take them. If that change is not actually targeted to accommodate some of their needs and to make sure their neighborhood can be continuing to meet the needs that they have, then to say, hey, we need to have housing in all neighborhoods is really just saying, you should suffer some more in some way. You should give up something else for kind of this citywide need and not get what you need back in return. And that's certainly not fair, and that's also not going to be a good dynamic for actually making the lot of people in the city better or creating a better city overall. So what we need to do, and this is where I feel like we need to find ways of enhancing our civic dialogue, is we need to find ways to take all of the folks that are participating in discussions in places like Greater Washington and people of all these other groups that I listed, and make sure that we are all having a conversation together about what we actually need. We need to find a way to work together to understand how we can actually essentially have an alternative to gentrification, ideally. Maybe this is going to be something of a pipe dream, but I think that there are a lot of elements that we already understand that can be a part of this. How can we have sort of a different type of process that is not a bunch of people come into a neighborhood, that neighborhood changes, people in that neighborhood get pushed out? How can we instead have a planning process and a public policy and a civic dialogue of how can new people come into a neighborhood, but that is actually good, not bad, for people in that neighborhood? And to do that, we have to be doing a lot more of communicating with people in those neighborhoods. And that is what I see as not entirely happening. Instead, what you have is sort of a strange dynamic, where when there are articles in things like the Washington Post about these issues, you get something like an article I saw about maybe 6 months ago about trees. This was in a neighborhood in, I think it was in Anacostia, but it might be another East of the River neighborhood, where they were talking about whether to have trees whether more trees were good in this particular community. And someone was quoted saying, I don't want trees because trees will create shade for drug dealers, and at the same time, trees will make our property values go up, and that will push all of us out of our neighborhood. Now, thinking about that from a little bit of a policy standpoint, you'd think, well, that's really kind of paradoxical, right? So either if it's going to attract crime, then it won't raise the property values. If it's going to raise the property values, then, but regardless, but those are actually, but if we look below that, it's actually a very understandable concern and a very legitimate fear, right? And we have seen in our politics and our political debates a lot of these discussions, like when we were having the Fenty Gray race almost 4 years ago now. Adrian Fenty was trying to bring things like rec centers to a lot of communities, and there were a lot of people saying, we are afraid of these rec centers because they will make the neighborhood more attractive, to for gentrification, and then our neighborhood will change, and then we won't be welcome in our neighborhood anymore. And I think that there's sort of something fundamentally frustrating and disappointing about a dynamic, but understandable. I'm not trying to discredit people who say this, because they really are afraid of this, and it's probably a really legitimate fear. But at the same time, surely we should be able to find a way that we can help people make their neighborhood better by actually investing public resources in someone's neighborhood that they feel like actually makes their neighborhood better. So I'm not trying to say that we all need to then therefore swoop into these neighborhoods and tell everybody what's good for them. No, and that's of course very much what one should not do. What we need to do is actually foster more of a dialogue with people in those neighborhoods to understand what they want and why, and even if that does not therefore lead to a policy outcome that's what we think it already should going in. But getting back to what I was saying at the beginning, what Greater Washington I think has been able to do fairly effectively is help educate people about the complexity about the decisions to be made. That we don't just talk about the immediate impact of a particular choice, but the broader effects of that choice and the long-term implications. So we need to have a dialogue with people all over the city about the long-term implications of particular things we could do. Because for someone to say, well, I don't want more buildings in my community because the last time you built a big building, it brought this, and that was negative for us. How can we say, not therefore the answer should be each neighborhood continues to push against other neighborhoods to kind of beat the change away and push it to someone else's part of the city, which certain neighborhoods will almost always lose that fight because they're less powerful. But rather, how do we actually help more people around the city of all groups understand that if we take this particular public policy approach and this particular approach to change in that neighborhood, and then that will lead to these outcomes, and this will lead to those outcomes, and so forth, and therefore help people coalesce around a better understanding of what they actually want, as opposed to perhaps what they might think they want, not understanding it well. And there's a difference between what people actually, I'm not saying what people should want because we tell them, I'm saying actually helping people understand what they actually want once they are well-versed and have been able to consider thoroughly the implications of different decisions. So what I'd like to talk with all of you about a little bit is what forms you think some of those dialogues can take. I'm very interested right now in figuring out how to take what we've been able to do in this sort of online forum that works very well for a subset of folks and to make it work very well for other folks and to be able to have those folks' voices be a part of the discussion and be amplified. I have always been open to having Greater Washington be a place that people of all communities talk about what they want for their neighborhoods, but because of perhaps the medium, maybe because of perhaps the messengers, there has been a kind of gravitation toward having a certain type of voices on the site. So how can we have more here, or how can we have more in other ways where it's not just new media? Maybe we're connecting new media and old media, new frontiers of civic engagement and very old frontiers of civic engagement together in having that conversation. So that's sort of my question to all of you, and I want to hear what you have to say about that, where we can go with that, and then after we talk for a little bit, maybe I'll wrap up with some closing thoughts.
That's great. Thank you, David. I heard David issue a challenge, so who's ready to respond? Yeah.
Please wait for the microphone so we can hear the recording of it.
How you doing? Is this on?
Yes, but it's recording.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. And I would think that a unique way to maybe get some of those voices back to the constituency that read online would be to maybe send out some of the folks from Greater Washington, do a series of community meetings, maybe east of the river, some parts of Northeast and other parts around the city, and then maybe post those online and those concerns online for the readership to be able to understand those.
Mm-hmm.
And then once maybe a comment section is kind of, created and the dialogue is continued, come back to that very same group that you started with and say, hey, here's what our readers think, and kind of get that going through different mediums.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm very much a fan of participatory processes in general. So I really like that you're saying that. I also am very concerned about gentrification in general, so I'm glad you're bringing that up. What's not clear to me is how and why a participatory process is the best way to address gentrification. Gentrification is so complicated and sort of so slippery
Right.
to understand. So I think a little bit about sort of like the community wealth movements that are kind of trying to bring wealth to underserved communities, and that's a way of kind of warding against gentrification and also developing at the same time. But that doesn't seem like something which arises out of a participatory process. So, but maybe, I'm sorry, this is a long question.
It's a very good question.
But maybe sort of has a participatory component with sort of an initiative brought to a community. So I guess that's what I'm wondering about is sort of why you think to go to a participatory process in addressing gentrification.
That's a really good question. And I think that, there's no simple answer, but as you said, there's an important role for sort of participatory processes, and then there are limits to them. Because you can't, simply say, if everyone said what they thought, that we would come, what's the right answer, but like that we would come to an answer that's even good for the most people. I think that what we have generally done, I can only sort of say what we have generally done in the kind of realms that we have been working so far. And that is that a lot of the discussion is where we have people who are writing who do have maybe some level of knowledge about the issues that is a little bit more than the average person's level of knowledge, but they also have a lot in common with the readers. So they can sort of say, let me show you what I see when I look at this building. Like an architect could talk about a building and say, let's look at the Georgetown downtown building. I've noticed this thing here, and this is here, and so forth. And people learn from that. And the same thing for transportation. This transportation expert or person who knows a lot about transportation can explain what you can see. And they're not trying to tell you sort of what you should conclude. They're trying to sort of help you learn a way of looking at the problem that maybe leads to a worldview and an understanding that that somewhat harmonizes with that person's, but that rather than them saying end goal is here, they're saying let me show you a path, and let's kind of walk that path together. So that's sort of like a guided participation in a way sometimes, but not necessarily like in a very orchestrated way. Like a big part of blogging is just you write a lot of things and you just have a lot of discussions. And I like to talk about it as being sort of like a collage, that like one of those ones where you step back and it's a picture of Abraham Lincoln or whatever it might be, all the different photographs, that by talking about a lot of different pieces, you get a broader picture. So that's one element of it. The other element I would say is I also would like to see this effort that I've been describing anchored in a few principles that maybe I think are really important. One is that I think we should be inclusionary. And by that I mean everyone should be inclusionary. We should say that people who want to come into the city should be able to. Some people don't agree with that. Some people think, why do we need new people in this city? Like, let's not have them. I think that that's not only sort of wrong on a policy matter, sort of like on a little bit of a moral dimension. If our city is so great, shouldn't we want to share it with more people and be a place that can serve more people with our greatness? Same for other neighborhoods. I think neighborhoods should be interested in having more people come into their neighborhood, and they should be interested in having their neighborhood have more diversity, whether that's people of higher or lower incomes than they have today, different colors and so forth than they have now. I think we should sort of be tolerant of differences in terms of things like modes of travel as well. We should understand that different people want to go to different types of stores. Different people will get around different ways. They might want different types of recreation. And we should kind of accommodate that rather than looking at it from a policy lens of, well, this works for me, so we should have more of this and not this other thing. And I hope, and I don't know for sure, but my hope is that if we sort of get people who agree on those principles and say, let's all kind of be together in agreeing on these basic ideas, then the specific type of road design or building shape that we end up with it might or might not be a particular one, but it's not just going to be like, whatever the heck you want. Because if they say, well, we've concluded that the answer should be no development at all because we don't want anything to ever change, I say, well, that's contrary to these sort of ethical principles as well, so that shouldn't be the answer. But within the realm of things that comply with it, there's a lot of possible answers.
So I wrote down 3 steps that I would recommend to you.
Great.
One would be to dispatch your brain trust to all anchor institutions and communities and to train representatives of those communities in basic messaging on whatever it might be. That's a whole separate question I have, but does this function as a forum for discussion, or does it function as a living, breathing agenda that you hope is representing the entire inclusive population of
Right.
Greater Washington? The second would be to facilitate dialogues that hold locally elected officials, developers, and this influx of people who are doing the active gentrifying accountable. Because if you are going to a neighborhood community conversation where you're seeing all the stakeholders from your community, that is immediately going to create a shift in your behavior and how you're thinking about the decisions you're making and where you're investing and that kind of thing. And the third would be to create small victories to engage that population that you're trying to best reach.
Small what's?
Small victories.
Victories.
So we'll do a get out the vote effort. We'll have a session at the local library where young kids will go and post their own post on Greater Washington, just to create that kind of empowerment.
Great. And one thought to tie your ideas and the gentleman who spoke first together is, and I think those are all fantastic ideas that both of you raised. And then I'm interested in, and you, the first gentleman sort of, I think, had some things that lean in that direction, is how can we also then leverage the kind of the power of media a little bit to achieve these, right? Because there are a lot of models of community organizing that people have done for many years, and I don't need to reinvent that wheel for sure. And then one thing I think that's been great about Greater Washington is that sort of with very little resources, because we're kind of on the internet, a lot of people get to see what we think. So I just write something and like, boom, look at all these people that see it, right? But not everybody is those people that are seeing it. So, but that has a lot of power, and so I want to try to sort of figure out how to not lose that, right? And to be able to go to other places and say, let's do these sort of more labor-intensive things that involve talking to more folks, but in a way that also, we don't then suddenly have to scale down from X amount of input reaches all these people to X amount of input now reaches these 5 people only. But also at the same time, I understand that in a lot of communities, one-on-one interaction is fundamental and a necessary part, as opposed to maybe some demographic groups are like, that's fine, I just get everything online or whatever. A lot of that's an age thing. I don't think that's necessarily a not a race thing or a ethnicity thing so much as often an age thing, because sort of younger people tend to be more comfortable with a lot of the technology because it's been around their whole lives and so forth.
Sorry, just one little thing to add, but another example of a small victory, just wrap your head around it. You could have kind of your ward or neighborhood dispatchers who are responsible for getting the top 5 things going on in DC up on a message board that everyone would
Right.
walk by, or it's posted at the bus stop. Just really
Yeah.
simple ways to get that message out
Good
to all
ideas.
communities.
Great.
Hi there. I don't know if this is necessarily a question, but more of a comment. I agree with a lot of what you're saying, by the way. But I'm working on a lot of projects in communities, including a few across the river. And just a consistent trend that we see, and I see whenever I'm out in these communities, in community meetings, in any sort of interaction with the individuals that actually live in these communities, is that it seems like there's always the perspective of our voice wasn't heard. And a lot of times when they're showing up to the community meetings, a lot of the frustrations and the questions and the things that they're saying they want, you were talking about helping people understand their needs and what they truly want to get those needs, are things that are predating what's relevant for that particular project or that thing or a particular point in time. So even just as recently as last week, a community seemingly was called a meeting because they were upset with construction noise, but really they wanted reimbursement from the earthquake 2 years ago. Things like this. So I think I love the ideals, but I think something that's going to have to happen before then is to find a way to politically empower individuals or small groups of people, city blocks, whatever it is, in a way that allows them to more proactively get involved in the conversation. And media probably is a big part of that. I don't know much about media, but good luck.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, there was actually a related sort of story that kind of relates to what you're saying that I've been sort of trying to figure out a little bit. We had a contributor who was writing some articles about a process in Anacostia about vacant property that the city owned, the Big K site, which has DHCD has owned for a long time and has been a kind of source of neighborhood consternation for a long time. And he said when he went to these meetings, the main thing that people were concerned about was the process by which they decided which neighborhood representatives were kind of empowered to advocate with HUD and the city about what they wanted. And so his articles were sort of about, maybe this gets to your question about the kind of participatory process. The concerns were about the process of selecting sort of the spokesperson. And I mean, I really don't want to say this in a way that's like sort of denigrating to this community. That was what people were really concerned about. And I totally understand that, as you said, like a lot of people feel their voices have never been heard. And so, well, the first step then is like, how do I get my voice to be heard? That makes sense. In a kind of politically empowered communities, everyone's like, I'm not worried about getting heard, so let me tell you what I think, And so you have to make sure that, and then it's a different dynamic where people don't feel empowered. But at the same time, that makes me kind of sad because that is sort of in a way, I worry that it was destructive to this community's own interests because we weren't getting to talk about how to make the site better and what could be good to go there. It was a kind of getting bogged down in the process. And so so I think that's a really good point. And I don't want, I don't want to say that in a way that's to say like, look, everybody was looking at the wrong thing. Everyone was looking at the thing that they thought was the most important thing. So as I think what you're saying is sort of how do we help people achieve that thing, and then they can move on to another thing, as opposed to saying, don't worry, stop talking about that. Like you're wasting your time. Like no, because that's not what you want to say, and that's, people have a legitimate desire around this.
In terms of reaching people and having a larger audience, I was thinking churches could be one avenue, whether, historically black church, historically Latino church. And you'd have to be very delicate about how you approached it. You wouldn't want to, like, you or someone like you be the person to send the message. It would have to be, you first establish a relationship with like someone that's the head of the church or whatever, and then coordinate with them. But I just think, say an ANC meeting, I was at the recent hearings and someone commented that less than 10 people had been at the most recent Ward 8 ANC meeting or something. Well, if at a church setting, whether it's during the congregation or other hours, you might reach a lot more people. Such as one avenue.
Definitely. Great. Hi.
One other answer to kind of this whole idea is also to maybe reach out to the high schools, because all of the new development in the high schools, they've been refurbished and they have a lot more technology. Maybe you could coordinate internships through DC government, how they have the summer youth program, and maybe coordinate that on a greater scale, or even with the university level and have a liaison between, I don't know your capacity, but since there's a lot of new technology development within the high schools, that's like a church. But probably has a bigger capacity, coordinate with the principal, give an internship to a young student who's savvy in the community and reach out like that.
Absolutely. And to what we were talking about before, that the level of technological engagement among young people is at its highest. Typically, people in the schools will be, well engaged technologically. So some of these sort of, online mechanisms can engage them perhaps, most readily.
We are tight on time, so I'm going to ask people to make a very short question or statement. We'll do a last round of comments.
I guess trying to really wrap this question up quick, and my side's more one-sided on a development standpoint, but you get the idea of making a financial feasible and you want to attract the customers and create that. My idea would be to set up more of a development platform and say, listen, here's my site, here's what I'm proposing, what works for the community there. And I think in that situation, it's more of what stage. Do you take it as the whole region as a whole, or are you going specifically by development? Because from there, as a developer, you want the project to succeed, you want people to take input and make a successful project, but at the same time, coming in at the right time creates different drama and different questions and restrictions in that case.
Great.
One here, and then I'll come over in a second.
Hi,
Hi.
I was thinking about polling your readers. I just became a subscriber to it in May when I moved back to the area. And what would they like to see in Greater Greater? I don't know if you do anything like that. And also how they hear about your site. So maybe that kind of would gauge how you go throughout.
Absolutely.
Building on what this gentleman said, talking about high schools, I think would be really neat, and this is probably long-term and maybe pie in the sky, but actually changing curriculum, like education curriculum, to include geography education, maybe even going into planning, but more so even just civic engagement and starting at the very youngest levels. So getting first graders out to public meetings and stuff like that and getting them involved at the youngest age possible so that they grow up doing that and seeing that as a regular thing.
Absolutely.
I was really excited to hear that you're looking at how to expand this dialogue. I think you guys do an awesome job of kind of putting out the smart growth ideals and stuff like that, and I think that's where Greater Washington is really strong. I think one way to broaden the conversation would be to literally just broaden the topics. Things like job quality or more talk about affordable housing, things like that, I think would be big. And one way to do that might be to actively recruit some other voices. I think some people mentioned that, but like making relationships with people who can kind of speak for other communities. And there was some talk about organizing, but I think you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of organizations that are out there. Someone mentioned churches. There's actually a really great organization that organizes churches called the Industrial Areas Foundation. Out here it's called WIN. And so, if you start talking to some of the organizers, they might be able to put you in touch with pastors. And a lot of those guys do know a lot about their parishioners and stuff.
Yeah.
And I would emphasize that one-on-one is really important, maybe for everyone, because in a blog format, it's really like, this is my opinion.
Right.
How often do you see someone, how often do you read a blog and be like, you know what, I was totally wrong about that? And actually, you're probably pretty open-minded, you might do that, but I think a lot of people just get mad, like, I disagree, and this is why they're wrong.
Sure.
So I think constructive dialogue that is facilitated in a way that helps people be open, I think is important, and one-on-one relationships.
Right. And, to your point about sort of the people getting angry online, we try actually very hard, more than most sites, much more, to sort of make sure our comment sections stay kind of respectful and to be discussions or debates about the issue and not let people kind of start attacking each other. But just no matter, even, and some people will inevitably feel like they're like, you censored my comment, and they get really mad or whatever. But just no matter what, there are definitely folks that then feel like, if they put up an opinion, they'll get criticized, even if the criticism is all like factual, like, well, that's you make this point, but on the other hand, look at this stat, and then there are a lot of people that feel, of all kinds of people, that feel sort of put, like a little bit attacked by that. And so, yeah, I mean, we've had some people try to, write who have then said, but I got criticized a lot. And so, how to kind of deal with that is a big question.
David, I'd like to thank you. I have
Thanks.
two quick observations. First
Great.
is you're our first speaker this fall that has come and asked us questions. Most of our speakers have come and provided their own solutions. So I think that is in and of itself indicative of where the conversation is going and how the conversation is structured. So
Yep.
I really deeply
Thanks
appreciate
very
that.
much.
And then finally, just to close out, I have an idea.
Great.
And that is maybe we can collaborate with some of the emerging planning programs in the
Sounds
region.
good.
And see if we can harness the incredible potential and vitality and insight of students in the actual debate of what's going on in the city.
Great. Yeah, I wonder where there is such a planning program. Can I give a
Sure.
quick closing thought?
Please.
So I just wanted to also thank everyone so much for being here, and thank Uwe for being for having me here and organizing this whole speaker series. And Greater Washington is you all made a lot of good comments, and someone asked sort of about resources, right? We are almost entirely volunteer-based, and so whether it's sort of in a collaboration with a planning program like Georgetown's, or if you're not affiliated with that at all, just as individuals, please talk to me about ways that you might be able to participate in this. Maybe you want to help us explore some of these things that you just said, or write for the site, or know people that are, would do so, or just in general, help us make this go this way. Because I'm not doing this for money. I'm not doing this, for great power. I'm trying to really make the city better, because I see this as kind of a fundamental schism right now, and something that I want to see us fix. So I hope, if you're interested, I hope in whatever way you want to, you can help me go try to work on mending this schism. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And I hope, we're very new. We're here. We have our space now. We're slowly getting more established, and we hope this won't be the last time we have you over
Thanks
to
so
the
much.
school.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.